December of 1944, a canvas tent behind the lines near Werbomont, Belgium. Outside, snow falls sideways in a wind that finds every gap in the fabric. Inside, a single bulb swings over a wooden table, and on the other side of that table sits a German officer, hands still cuffed, uniform stripped of rank insignia, eyes fixed somewhere past the interrogator's shoulder. He has just watched his Kampfgruppe, one of the finest armored spearheads the Third Reich had left, stopped cold at a river crossing by men who dropped from the sky with nothing but rifles, grenades, and their own legs to carry them. The interrogator asks the obvious question, "Who did this to you?" The officer does not hesitate. He gives a number, 82nd. That scene repeated itself, not once, not twice, across 4 years of war, in interrogation huts in Sicily, in prisoner cages outside Naples, in holding pens along the Wall River in Holland, and in canvas tents freezing in the Ardennes forest. German officers of every rank, men with no reason to flatter an enemy who had just defeated them, kept saying some version of the same thing about one American division. Not the division Hollywood chose to make famous. Not the one with the television series and the movie deals. A different one. The 82nd Airborne. This is the story of what those captured officers actually said, in their own words, recorded in interrogation reports that still sit in American military archives today. And it is the story of why the pattern in their testimony, once you see it laid out from beginning to end, changes what you thought you knew about who did the hardest fighting in this war. To understand what those German prisoners were describing, you first have to understand what almost never got built at all. In 1942, the American Army did not believe in large airborne divisions. Parachute infantry existed in small experimental battalions, treated by most senior officers as a novelty, a stunt for newsreels rather than a real branch of the military. It took the German seizure of Crete in May of 1941, an operation that cost German paratroopers so many casualties that Hitler himself later forbade another large airborne assault, to convince American planners that vertical envelopment might actually work if it were built differently. In August of 1942, the 82nd Infantry Division, an outfit that traced its own lineage back to the First World War, was redesignated as the 82nd Airborne Division under Major General Matthew Ridgway. Nobody in Berlin was watching. Nobody in Washington was entirely convinced either. The doubts did not survive contact with Sicily. On the night of July 9, 1943, the 505 Parachute Infantry Regiment, along with the 3rd Battalion of the 504, became the first American paratroopers in history to jump into combat. High winds scattered the drop badly, flinging men across miles of Sicilian farmland instead of the tight drop zones planners had drawn on their maps. 2 nights later, when Colonel Reuben Tucker led the rest of the 504 in to reinforce them, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Nervous American naval gunners and ground troops, still jittery from days of German air raids, opened fire on their own transport planes. 23 aircraft went down. Men who had survived enemy fire in the sky died over their own beachhead, killed by their own side. It should have been the end of the story. Instead, scattered in isolated pockets across roads and hillsides the paratroopers had never trained to occupy, small groups of American troopers began doing something the German command did not expect. They fought anyway. They cut communication lines, ambushed reinforcement columns, and above all, they got in the way of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division as it raced to throw the American seaborne landings back into the sea. Years later, asked to give his own verdict on what had happened, the German general most responsible for inventing airborne warfare in the first place did not hedge. Kurt Student, the father of the German paratroopers, said plainly that the delay those scattered American units inflicted on German armor accounted for the entire success of the invasion. Without it, he said, the Hermann Göring Division would have driven the invasion force back into the water before enough men and guns could be landed to stop them. Coming from the one man in Europe who understood better than almost anyone what airborne troops could and could not do, it was not flattery. It was a professional assessment, delivered without any need to be generous to a former enemy. And it was the first entry in a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 20 months of war. 2 months after Sicily, the pattern held again. When German counterattacks nearly drove the American Fifth Army back into the sea at Salerno in September, Tucker's 504 jumped again, this time at night, directly onto a beachhead already under fire, to shore up a collapsing line. When German armor surrounded part of his position near the town of Altavilla, Tucker radioed his answer to a suggestion that he pull back. "Retreat," he said. "Send me my other battalion." The line held. But it was Anzio, 4 months later, that gave the regiment the name history remembers it by, a name that did not come from an American public relations officer or a newspaper headline, but from the diary of a German officer who never lived to see it published. The Anzio beachhead, established in January of 1944 in an attempt to outflank German defenses south of Rome, quickly turned into something closer to the trenches of the First World War than anything airborne troops had trained for. Barbed wire strung between shattered farmhouses, minefields sown in the gaps between foxholes, artillery falling so constantly that men learned to read the sound of an incoming shell the way sailors read weather. For 8 weeks, Tucker's paratroopers held a stretch of that line, fighting not the fast-moving war they had trained for, but a grinding, static contest measured in yards and bodies. At night, small patrols crossed no man's land to raid German positions, moving without lights, communicating in hand signals, killing at close range and disappearing again before dawn. The Germans facing them could never predict where the next raid would fall, and after weeks of this, exhaustion turned to something closer to dread. That dread survives today on a single piece of paper. When Allied troops recovered the body of a German officer killed on the Anzio line, they found his diary, and inside it, an entry that the men of the 504 would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Translated, it read close to this: American parachutists, devils in baggy pants, are less than 100 meters from my outpost line. I cannot sleep at night. They appear from nowhere, and we never know when or how they will strike again. It seems the black-hearted devils are everywhere. The nickname spread through the regiment within days. Someone painted a grinning, pitchfork-wielding devil onto a scrap of leather and pinned it above a doorway. It became the unofficial insignia of the 504, worn with a pride no official citation could have generated, because it had not been given to them by their own command. It had been written, in fear, by the enemy trying to kill them. While Tucker's regiment recovered in England from the losses at Anzio, the rest of the 82nd Airborne prepared for an operation that would prove, in a single night, just how much damage a badly scattered airborne drop could still inflict on an enemy who thought he understood exactly where his front line was. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, more than 6,000 paratroopers of the 82nd jumped into the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. Cloud cover, flak, and inexperienced pilots scattered the drop across miles of hedgerow country, far worse than Sicily had been. Some men landed in flooded marshland the Germans had deliberately created, and drowned under the weight of their own equipment before they could cut free of their harnesses. Others landed almost on top of German positions that had no idea an invasion was underway. One of those men was Private John Steele of the 505 Parachute Infantry Regiment. His parachute caught on the spire of the church in the town square of Sainte-Mère-Église, and he hung there, suspended above the cobblestones, while German soldiers and American paratroopers fought through the streets below him. Wounded and unable to free himself, Steele played dead for more than 2 hours, listening to the church bells ring inches from his head with every burst of gunfire, before a German soldier finally cut him down and took him prisoner. He escaped days later and rejoined his unit. Sainte-Mère-Église became the first town in France liberated by American forces that day, and Steele's parachute still hangs from that church spire in effigy, a fixture of the town more than 80 years later. A few miles away, near the village of Picauville, a small group of paratroopers from the 508, scattered far from their objective and simply trying to find their bearings in the dark, set up a hasty ambush position along a country road. A staff car approached. Inside was Generalleutnant Wilhelm Falley, commander of the German 91st Infantry Division, racing back from a wargame exercise the moment he saw the sky fill with aircraft. The paratroopers opened fire. Falley died within yards of his own headquarters gate, becoming the first German general killed in the battle for Normandy, shot not by a planned assault, but by a handful of lost men who had simply decided to make themselves useful. The heaviest fighting that week centered on a stone bridge at Fière, where the Murderette River crossed a narrow causeway flanked on both sides by flooded swamp. First Lieutenant John Dolan of the 505, a red-haired officer his men called Red Dog for his temper and his tenacity, gathered nearly his entire company at the bridge before dawn and held it against repeated German counterattacks, including armor, for 3 straight days. The causeway became a killing ground, so thickly covered with German dead by the end of the fighting that veterans who walked it afterward struggled to describe it without their voices changing. A German infantryman writing home from the Cotentin front that week described the chaos more starkly than any official report ever could. "We destroy one group of them," he wrote, "and by the time we are finished, 3 more groups appear behind us, as if the hedgerows themselves are producing paratroopers. German intelligence officers trying to piece together what had actually landed on the Cotentin Peninsula that night faced an impossible task. Reports came in from a dozen directions at once, describing fighting that suggested a force many times larger than what had actually jumped. They were not wrong that something enormous had happened to their front line. They were wrong about why. To understand why a scattered, disorganized airborne drop kept producing the same bewildered reports from German command, you have to understand a doctrine the paratroopers themselves had a blunt name for. They called the fragments of units that formed after a bad drop little groups of paratroopers, and rather than treat those fragments as a failure to be corrected, American airborne training had quietly built an entire philosophy around making them dangerous anyway. Every American paratrooper jumped into Normandy knowing his objective, not just his company's objective or his platoon's, but the mission of the entire operation. Non-commissioned officers were trained to assume command the moment an officer went down. Privates were trained to link up with whatever fragment of friendly troops they found, regardless of unit patch, and simply continue fighting toward the sound of the guns. It was a doctrine built on the assumption that the plan would fall apart within minutes of landing, and that the men on the ground needed to be capable of improvising a new one without waiting for orders from above. German military culture, particularly after the catastrophic losses paratrooper forces suffered on Crete in 1941, had moved in the opposite direction. Command remained tightly centralized. Junior officers were expected to report up the chain and wait for direction rather than act independently at the first sign of chaos. It was a system built for a war of clear front lines and predictable movement, and it had no framework for what was actually happening in the Norman countryside, where a dozen exhausted men with one working machine gun might hold a crossroads with the same stubbornness as an entire battalion. This is the detail that shows up, campaign after campaign, in the interrogation reports German prisoners gave to American intelligence officers. Not admiration for equipment, which was often inferior to their own. Not admiration for numbers, which were almost always smaller than German commanders assumed. What kept appearing, in different words, from different officers in different years of the war, was confusion and something close to respect for an enemy that refused to behave like a scattered or defeated force, no matter how few of them were actually left standing in any given field. They fought, one report noted, like a full division, even when they numbered a dozen men. By September of 1944, Tucker's 504 had rejoined the division, and the 82nd was dropped into Holland as part of Operation Market Garden, tasked with seizing a chain of bridges leading toward the Rhine. The final and most important crossing sat at Nijmegen, where two bridges spanned the Wall River, a waterway wider and faster than almost anything American paratroopers had been asked to cross under fire before. German command had not been idle. SS General Wilhelm Bittrich, commanding the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, had rushed elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division, the Frundsberg, into the city, placing battle groups under officers named Reinhold and Euling at both ends of the road bridge. For 3 days, American paratroopers and British armor tried to fight their way through the city street by street and failed to dislodge them. By September 20th, with British paratroopers trapped and dying at Arnhem just a few miles further north, there was no time left for a conventional assault. The plan that emerged was, by any normal military calculation, close to suicidal, and the German defenders watching it unfold clearly thought so too. Major Julian Cook's 3rd Battalion of the 504 would cross the wall in broad daylight, in flimsy canvas assault boats never designed for a river of that width, directly into the field of fire of German machine guns and artillery positioned on the opposite bank with a completely unobstructed view. At 3 in the afternoon, under a hastily arranged smokescreen that the wind kept tearing apart, the first wave of boats pushed off. German gunners on the far bank had clear lines of sight for most of the crossing. Of the 26 boats that started across in that first wave, only about half made it to the northern shore intact. Men paddled with rifle butts when oars were shot away. Men bailed water from punctured hulls with their helmets while still under fire. Colonel Tucker, watching from the southern bank, reportedly turned to an aide and called it a suicide mission in the moments before it began. He sent his men anyway, because the alternative was losing the entire British division trapped at Arnhem. They did not lose. The survivors of that crossing stormed the German positions on the northern bank, working their way toward the bridge itself in brutal close-range fighting, while another battalion attacked the western end from the opposite direction. By late afternoon, both ends of the bridge were in American hands, and the demolition charges the Germans had wired to destroy it never fired. One officer of the Frundsberg Division, describing the crossing years afterward, put it as simply as any soldier could. "We had every advantage of ground and firepower," he said, "and they crossed anyway. After that day, we stopped trusting our own maps of how many men we were actually facing." 3 months later, in the dead of a Belgian winter, the 82nd Airborne faced the final and most dangerous test of its reputation among captured German officers, not against exhausted garrison troops this time, but against the spearhead of Adolf Hitler's last major offensive in the West. When German panzer columns broke through American lines in the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, the most feared of those columns belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, commanding a battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, one of the most heavily equipped and fanatically loyal formations left in the German army. Peiper's tanks needed intact bridges to keep moving toward the Meuse River and the fuel depots beyond it. American combat engineers blew the bridge at Trois Ponts just hours ahead of his column, forcing Peiper to search desperately for another crossing. He found one at the village of Chenot, and for several days that stretch of frozen countryside became a battlefield fought in snow so deep men lost their boots in it, under skies too overcast for the air support that had shredded German columns elsewhere. Tucker's 504 rushed to the area with almost no rest after Holland, launched a direct assault on Chenot against German half-tracks and infantry dug into the village. According to the after-action reports filed afterward, paratroopers closed the final distance under fire and climbed directly onto moving German vehicles, killing the crews at their stations in hand-to-hand fighting before the position could be reinforced. The village fell. Peiper's column, already running low on fuel, never recovered its momentum. Further south along the Somme River, the 505 held a defensive line against repeated attacks by that same 1st SS Panzer Division for days, absorbing assault after assault while cut off and undersupplied, until German commanders were forced to conclude that the division blocking their path could no longer be considered anything close to combat effective by the time the fighting ended. It was the 82nd, not German armor, that made that assessment true. For the officers of the Leibstandarte captured in the fighting around Trois Ponts in Chenot that December, the shock ran deeper than tactical surprise. These were men who had fought the Red Army on the Eastern Front, men who considered themselves the ideological and martial elite of the entire German military. One captured officer told his interrogators flatly, "We have fought Russians who did not fear death," he said. "These men fought as though death simply did not apply to them at all." Being stopped repeatedly by American paratroopers fighting in waist-deep snow with no armor of their own to speak of, was not a defeat the men of the Leibstandarte found easy to explain. Several of them, independently of each other and with no way to have compared notes, reached for the same word American intelligence officers had started hearing since Sicily. Fanatical, except now they were using it to describe the men who had beaten them, not themselves. The interrogation summary filed after that night in the Ardennes still survives in the division's own after-action records. The officer who opened the story, asked directly what made the 82nd different from other American units his Kampfgruppe had faced, gave an answer that reads almost like an admission wrenched out of him against his will. "They do not fight like men who know they are losing," he said. "They fight like men who already believe they have won." By the time the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the 82nd Airborne Division had fought in 4 major campaigns, sustained more than 8,000 casualties, and accumulated an interrogation file, spread across dozens of separate incidents and years, that told a strikingly consistent story. Not one written by American public relations officers looking to build a legend. One written, piece by piece, involuntarily, by the men who had been sent to defeat this division and failed. Kurt Student saw it in Sicily and called it decisive. An anonymous diarist at Anzio saw it and called the men devils. German intelligence officers in Normandy saw it and simply could not explain it, mistaking a handful of little groups of paratroopers for something many times their actual size. An officer of the Frundsberg Division saw it on the banks of the Wall and stopped trusting his own maps. Officers of an elite SS division saw it in the snow at Chenot and reached, almost against their will, for a word they had always reserved for themselves. This is not the version of the airborne war most people know. The division that got the television series, the movie adaptations, and the enduring popular nickname belongs to the 101st Airborne, whose story at Bastogne deserves every bit of the attention it has received. But the 82nd jumped into more combat operations than any other American airborne division in the war, fought at Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, Holland, and the Ardennes, and generated its own body of enemy testimony just as extensive and just as consistent, largely absent from the version of this history most audiences have ever seen. The evidence for all of it still exists. Thousands of pages of after-action reports, interrogation summaries, and captured documents sit today in American military archives, filed under the division's own operational history, most of them never digitized for a general audience, most of them never read outside a small circle of historians and veterans' families. Somewhere in those pages is the full transcript of the interrogation that opened this story. One officer among dozens who said, in his own words, without flattery and without being asked to, that the men who beat him fought like something larger than they actually were. That was never really a mystery about the Germans who said it. It was a mystery about the Americans they were describing, ordinary men from ordinary towns across the United States, dropped alone into the dark, who simply decided, again and again, across 4 years and half a continent, that being outnumbered was never the same thing as being beaten.